Something unprecedented is unfolding in the Caribbean Sea. For the first time in the 21st century, the United States has assembled its largest concentration of military power in the Western Hemisphere since the 1989 invasion of Panama. This time, the forces are not aimed at a distant battlefield, but positioned just outside the territorial waters of Venezuela. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 1 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, at least 1 nuclear-powered attack submarine. Together, they carry dozens, possibly hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles. These warships are accompanied by the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, centered around the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima, supported by transport and logistics vessels capable of launching aircraft, helicopters, hovercraft, and amphibious assault vehicles. More than 2,500 U.S. Marines and roughly 2,000 sailors are now deployed in the region. Additional naval assets have joined them, bringing the total number of American vessels in the theater close to double digits. At the same time, F-35 fighter jets have been deployed to airfields in Puerto Rico, adding stealth strike capability to the growing force. The Trump administration's official explanation is straightforward: counter-narcotics operations. But the scale of this deployment tells a different story. Drug trafficking operations in the Caribbean are typically conducted using small, fast boats not defended by air forces, navies, or missile systems. Most narcotics entering the United States today arrive through the Pacific coast or air shipments, routes this flotilla cannot intercept. The presence of nuclear-powered submarines, strike aircraft, and thousands of Marines suggests objectives far beyond stopping speedboats. This has led to a single, unavoidable question: is this about drugs or regime change? The $50 million bounty weeks before the flotilla assembled, the United States doubled the bounty on Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro from $25 million to $50 million, the largest reward ever placed on a single individual by the U.S. government. To put that figure in perspective, it exceeds the bounties once offered for Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and the former leader of ISIS. The U.S. government does not recognize Maduro as Venezuela's legitimate president. Instead, he is treated as a fugitive accused of narcotics trafficking, corruption, and conspiracy. Maduro is not alone. His interior minister carries a $25 million bounty. His defense minister, $15 million. His minister of industry, $10 million. In total, the United States has placed approximately $100 million in rewards on Venezuela's senior leadership. These bounties are justified by allegations surrounding an organization known as the Cartel of the Sun's Group. The Trump administration claims operates from within Venezuela's military and political elite, facilitating drug trafficking in coordination with transnational criminal organizations. But even these claims are disputed. Several countries have accepted the designation. Others, including left-leaning governments in Latin America, have rejected it, calling it a political tool. U.S. intelligence assessments have at times contradicted public statements, finding no clear evidence of centralized state control over cartel operations. Still, the legal framework was established. In mid-2024, President Trump signed a classified directive authorizing the use of military force against Latin American criminal organizations designated as terrorist entities. Venezuela's most notorious gang, Tren de Aragua, was included. The historical implications were unmistakable. This marked a modern revival of the Monroe Doctrine, America's long-standing claim to intervene militarily in the Western Hemisphere when its interests are threatened. The first strike on September 2nd, the escalation became real. A vessel carrying 11 Venezuelans in international waters was destroyed by a missile, believed to have been fired by an American MQ-9 Reaper drone. No survivors. The U.S. government stated the boat was transporting drugs and linked to organized crime. Critics noted this marked a dramatic departure from decades of precedent in which suspected trafficking vessels were intercepted and boarded, not annihilated. The strike was widely interpreted as the first lethal U.S. drone operation against a Latin American criminal target. Soon after, reports emerged that Washington was considering direct strikes inside Venezuelan territory. Maduro responded with mobilization orders, troop deployments near Colombia, public warnings, and military exercises. Venezuelan fighter jets flew close to U.S. warships in a show of defiance. The United States warned they could be engaged if deemed a threat. For the first time in decades, the two countries stood openly on the brink of armed conflict. How it came to this? Venezuela's descent into crisis did not begin with Donald Trump. The country possesses the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. In the 1970s, it was one of Latin America's wealthiest nations. American oil companies partnered with Venezuela's state-owned firm PDVSA, creating deep economic ties with the United States. But corruption hollowed the system. Between the 1970s and 1990s, an estimated $100 billion vanished through mismanagement and embezzlement. Oil came to dominate the economy entirely. When prices collapsed in the 1980s, the nation spiraled into debt and unrest. Out of that chaos emerged Hugo Chavez. Elected in 1998, Chavez promised to redistribute wealth and challenge U.S. influence. His early policies reduced poverty but dismantled institutional safeguards. Experienced oil workers were fired. Foreign assets were seized. Oil profits were redirected toward political loyalty rather than reinvestment. When Chavez died in 2013, Nicolás Maduro inherited a brittle state. Then oil prices collapsed again. By 2016, Venezuela's economy was in freefall. Inflation exploded. Protests erupted. Maduro responded with repression. Elections became increasingly contested. Opposition figures were barred, arrested, or exiled. Trump's first term, maximum pressure. The Trump administration adopted a strategy known as maximum pressure. Sanctions targeted Venezuela's oil industry, financial system, and international trade. U.S. companies were banned from buying Venezuelan oil. Access to refining infrastructure was severed. Spare parts were blocked. Production collapsed. By the early 2020s, Venezuela was producing less oil than during World War II. The economy contracted by more than 70%. Hyperinflation reached astronomical levels. Millions fled the country. Ironically, the sanctions that failed to remove Maduro helped trigger one of the largest migration crises in the Western Hemisphere, an issue Trump later used as a central campaign theme. Still, Maduro survived. Biden's interlude and failure. The Biden administration attempted engagement. Limited sanctions relief was offered in exchange for electoral reforms. Oil licenses were restored temporarily. Maduro accepted the benefits and then tightened control. The 2024 election followed the same pattern as 2018. Disputed results. No transparent tallies. Opposition victory claims supported by documentation. Crackdowns followed. Western governments rejected the outcome. Maduro arrested opponents. One fled to exile. By the time Trump returned to office, diplomacy had collapsed. Trump's second term, gunboat diplomacy. Trump recalibrated. Economic pressure alone had failed. Diplomacy had failed. A new approach emerged: gunboat diplomacy. Sanctions returned. Bounties were doubled. Military forces assembled offshore. Covert directives expanded, targeting authority. This was not an invasion force. It was leverage. Trump's record shows a preference for limited, decisive strikes over prolonged wars. Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Iran. Precision operations designed to intimidate, disrupt, and destabilize. The forces near Venezuela fit that pattern. They enable surveillance, targeted strikes, decapitation operations, and support for internal uprisings without committing tens of thousands of troops. U.S. abduction of Venezuela's Maduro prompts global outcry. Members of the United Nations Security Council, including allies of the United States, have condemned Washington's seizure of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. U.S. President Donald Trump has described Maduro's seizure as brilliant and has threatened further military action against Venezuela, as well as against Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who has dismissed the threat as illegitimate. The detained leader told a court in New York that he considers himself a prisoner of war and pleaded not guilty to drug-related charges. Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has been sworn in as the country's interim leader. She has indicated that she will cooperate with the United States, but has described Maduro and his wife as hostages. Trump ally calls for Venezuelan elections within months. Republican Congressman Carlos Gimenez, whose Florida district is home to a large Venezuelan community, has said the new authorities in Caracas must hold elections soon. It can't be years, I'll tell you that right now. Gimenez was quoted as saying by Fox News, "This is what these regimes do. They negotiate for time, try to wait you out so you weaken your will. So it can't be that. I'm talking months. I am not talking years. Trump said it would take time to hold a vote in Venezuela, arguing that the United States must first nurse the country back to health. Venezuela under control of key figures in Maduro government, analyst says while Maduro may be gone, the government he oversaw remains in control in Caracas, with officials from his presidency maintaining authority over key institutions. If you ask me who is running the country in terms of military force, you could say it's the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, and the interior minister, Diosdado Cabello. But political reactions and public messaging are in the hands of the newly appointed interim president, Delcy Rodriguez. Venezuelan reporter Norris Argati Soto told Al Jazeera. So basically, these three people are the ones running the country right now, and still, nothing has changed, in fact. She added that paramilitary groups aligned with the government known as collectivos remain active and are still present on the streets, working with military forces to carry out security operations in the capital. Yusra Swady, an assistant professor of international law at the University of Manchester, said Washington cannot justify the seizure of Maduro by portraying it as a lawful arrest simply because he faces criminal charges in the United States. A state cannot lawfully justify violating international law by citing its own domestic law. This is a cardinal principle of international law. Swady told Al Jazeera. She stressed that a country cannot rely on its own laws or legal proceedings to justify the use of force against another state. Several U.S. officials have referred to the seizure of Maduro as a law enforcement operation, and a public service announcement for everyone saying this was illegal. Maduro has multiple indictments in the United States for narco-terrorism. U.S. Vice President Vance wrote on X following the operation. Swady warned that relying on domestic statutes to justify actions against other states is extremely dangerous. The logic behind international law is precisely to create a standard that all states must follow and respect, to avoid situations where domestic law or policy interferes with how states relate to one another and how they treat other states, she said. Trump hails brilliant seizure of Maduro. The U.S. president has continued to praise the operation that resulted in the capture of the Venezuelan president, calling it incredible. It was so complex. 152 airplanes. Many people talk about boots on the ground. We had a lot of boots on the ground, but it was amazing, Trump said of the operation, which leading rights experts have described as unlawful. Think of it, nobody was killed, and on the other side, a lot of people were killed. Unfortunately, I say that. Trump said the United States cut off electricity across the country before the operation. Caracas, there was no electricity. The only people with lights were those who had candles. It was completely shut off, he said. So we caught them a little by surprise. But it was brilliant. It was brilliant tactically. It was an incredible thing. Colombian foreign minister says military will defend country's sovereignty. Colombian Foreign Minister Rosa Yolanda Villavicencio said the country's armed forces would defend national sovereignty in the event of a U.S. military attack. If such an attack were to occur, the military must defend the national territory and the sovereignty of the country, she said. Villavicencio also said she would meet with the U.S. Embassy's charge d'affaires, John McNamara, later in the day to condemn what she described as insults and threats directed at Colombia and President Gustavo Petro. U.S. Congress's role questioned as Democrats bow to Ryan and Trump on Venezuela. It has become a familiar pattern. United States presidents conduct unilateral military actions abroad, and Congress responds with limited resistance. On Saturday, in the hours following the U.S. military seizure of Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro, Democrats in the U.S. Senate pledged to introduce another resolution aimed at curbing President Donald Trump's military authority. Chuck Schumer, the top Democrat in the chamber, said the party would push for a vote within the week. By most assessments, the likelihood of success remains low. Since Trump began his second term in 2025, Congress has considered multiple bills that would require him to seek legislative approval before initiating military strikes. However, the latest operation in Venezuela has been described as a clear case of presidential overreach, one that is crying out for congressional action, according to David Janowski, acting director of the Constitution Project at the Project on Government Oversight. Tucker Carlson says U.S. is acting like an empire. Trump has largely avoided a Republican backlash over his military actions in Venezuela, with most GOP lawmakers and affiliated media figures praising the seizure of Maduro. Dissent from the anti-interventionist right has been limited. Conservative commentator Tucker Carlson, one of the most influential figures associated with the America First movement, has offered some criticism of Trump's Venezuela policy without fully condemning it. In a recent newsletter, Carlson wrote that Trump appears to be pressuring interim Venezuelan President Rodriguez to take pro-US actions if she wants to avoid a similar fate to Nicolás Maduro. This could be what Donald Trump meant when he said the United States will run Venezuela, Carlson wrote. Rather than manage the country on a day-to-day basis, Washington will likely attempt to pull its strings from afar, effectively ruling it with the implied threat of further military action. If that strikes you as the behavior of an empire, you are correct. Venezuela's oil deliveries to Asia at a standstill. Chevron exports continue. Venezuela's main oil ports have entered their 5th consecutive day without delivering crude to state-run PDVSA's customers in Asia, the OPEC nation's primary buyers, according to shipping data reviewed by Reuters, as the United States intensifies pressure through an oil embargo. Chevron, PDVSA's main joint venture partner, resumed exports of Venezuelan oil to the United States after a 4-day pause and called overseas workers back to its Venezuela offices as flights to the country resumed. The U.S. company has emerged in recent weeks as the only firm consistently exporting Venezuelan crude. At least a dozen sanctioned vessels that loaded cargo in December departed Venezuelan waters in early January, carrying approximately 12 million barrels of crude and fuel bound for China. The ships traveled in dark mode, with transponders switched off, bypassing a U.S. tanker blockade imposed last month. A prolonged halt in oil exports to Asia could force PDVSA, which has already struggled to maintain output and refining operations, to deepen the production cuts it began in recent days amid an accumulation of crude and residual fuel inventories. The gamble removing Maduro could reshape the region. It could reopen oil markets, undermine U.S. adversaries, reduce cartel operations, stabilize migration, or it could unleash chaos. Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. History offers no guarantees. Venezuela's military is weakened but not defenseless. Its alliances with Russia, Iran, and China complicate escalation. A miscalculation could ignite a regional crisis. For now, the warships wait. Missiles are armed. Bounties stand. Diplomacy is narrowed to threats, and Venezuela sits at the center of a confrontation that has been building for decades, where sanctions failed, elections failed, and now force looms as the final instrument. Whether this ends in pressure, rebellion, or war remains unknown. But one thing is clear: the Caribbean is no longer quiet.